Okay, we are live.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the House Environment Committee. This afternoon, we are going to be talking about salt in the form of a House bill and a Senate bill that have remarkable similarities. And we welcome Jared Carpenter to orient us to this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Committee, good to see you again. For the record, my name is Jared Carpenter with the Lake Champlain Committee. Yes, so I'm here initially to do sort of a high-level discussion on the issue and the bill. Yes, the issue has been coming up more and more across the country. I was initially going to show a short video clip. We couldn't figure out how to. Well, I'll try to get the committee a better YouTube of it. But it happened a few days ago, March 21st, and it was the New York City, I think, Public Works Commissioner doing a press release in front of the reservoirs where they have the drinking water for Westchester County and New York City, citing his concerns with the fact the entire reservoir is becoming more saline. The salinity is increasing, and he's concerned about the road salt and what's going to happen to the drinking water of New York City. And he cites the fact that they have various treatments that they can use to get pathogens out, and they have other nutrients out of drinking water, but not salt. And so with that in mind, I was going to talk high level about the issue, and then there are two bills. The one here, there's H86, and downstairs in the Senate, it's S29. S29 has been discussed by the Senate, so they are no longer mirror images of each other than the as introduced, but that has been moving along currently in Senate Judiciary because there's a liability provision in the bill. But I just wanted to give you sort of an initial discussion. So Montpelier is a classic case example for the overuse of road salt. This when they have weather conditions or any ice or anything, the amount of salt that is applied is it crunches under your feet, and so you really get a sense of exactly the scope of the issue. Salt use for de-icing has been increasing nationwide for years. I mean, we've all been seeing it. I think folks probably heard a couple of weeks ago, there's probably 5 or 6 now, that there was a salt shortage where local applicators, commercial applicators couldn't find salt in this area. And I think one of the reasons because of that is because of the overuse. It is being put down at a rapid rate, mostly for obviously public safety reasons. The thought is if a little is good, then a lot must be better in terms of keeping the public safe. That's not the case, and it doesn't have to be. So this increased salinity, of our waters has, negative impacts on infrastructure, on public health, and on water quality. This includes corrosion of public and private drinking water systems, resulting in traces metals such as copper, iron, and lead in drinking water supplies. It has been found that one of the reasons that Flint, Michigan had high lead levels in their drinking water system was because of excessive use of road salt on the impervious surfaces, the sidewalks and the roads, which would then leach into surface waters, get into the system, and it corrodes the pipes and releases the metals into the drinking water system. It also is causing acceleration of corrosion of bridges, of roads, vehicles, reducing lifespans and usability. Everybody's had the car in Vermont that they feel that has its lifespan was a little shorter than they thought it would be because the bottom rusts out and it no longer passes inspection, and therefore it is no longer viable automobile. And of course, the increased salinity of rivers and lakes harms aquatic biota. This is, one of the basics of water quality standards, that increasing salinity is seen, throughout our state waters. As I mentioned, it's, this is being seen across the country, that salt has been infiltrating surface and groundwaters, impacting water supplies. I put a few materials that are posted up on the website. One is an article from Reuters on the impacts on drinking water. That's where this diagram is from. The lead in the water is seen across the top, or the little dots, the red dots are above the EPA threshold, and the testing sites there. And they attribute this to the DOT salt barge down here getting into the drinking water and then leaching through the water system and into people's homes. This is up in New York.
What is your presentation titled under today? I'm having a hard time finding it.
Impacts of road salt. Impacts of salt.
There's a bill number at the front of it.
Impacts of road, okay, got it.
So this is something that's not just being seen in the Midwest, but any colder area where we're seeing a lot of salt use. This is upstate New York. The Reuters article also talks about the infiltration that's being seen into private wells. So salt is spread upon, say the roads and the sidewalks. It runs off onto the ground next to the roads. Over time, it leaches into the groundwater. And then permeates the aquifers and starts leaching sideways into drinking water systems into people's wells. And so basically the same concept is that not only with big water infrastructure systems, it's being leached into private wells, corroding the pipes, and people are finding that they have increased salinity levels, like they can taste the salt in their well water. And it's also being seen of increases in lead and copper and other items. And it's a nice diagram here of how that all works. I really recommend that you read this Reuters article. I think it's from October of last year, so relatively recent. I talked to.
Does it soften hard water?
It's actually a good question. I think that it would. No? Nope. My understanding is it does not soften hard. Fortunate to have folks from the department here and here, just in case I need to have a question answered myself.
Representative Bartholomew.
Lead, is the lead a contaminant in the salt that's applied, or is it leaching from pipes and
It's
stuff?
coming from the pipes, so the salt gets into the water supply, increases the salinity, and corrodes the insides of the pipes. The same way it corrodes metal infrastructure, and that's the other problem that we're seeing with excessive use of road salt on. It is causing corrosion to bridges, to culverts, to other metal infrastructure, and it gets expensive for municipalities to replace, and shortens the lifespan of a lot of these structures. Like I mentioned, also the car. So this is the increased impact that we're seeing with the road salt use in Vermont in water quality levels. These are all 18 Lake Champlain tributaries, ranging from the Winooski up top in the Meadowy down to the Lewis towards the bottom, that are all seeing to varying degrees increased levels in salinity. Salinity has sort of, and the department can talk about this more than I can, but you're seeing it in two levels. There's the chronic level, which is sort of this gradual increase up here. And the chronic level certainly harms aquatic biota, but you also see acute spikes. So for example, when we have snow melt and all the salt that is on the roads and everything suddenly runs into the water, you're going to see a blip, and that causes, even more so of an impact, particularly on invertebrates in aquatic biota. So this is harming aquatic systems all the way, into our streams and lakes, smaller streams that have a lot of impervious surface around them. Here in Montpelier, I've always, we've wondered what the North Branch here and the Winooski are when during those runoff events, when you see a lot of salt run into the waters. Then of course it all runs into Lake Champlain, and takes a number of years for it to sort of flush through the system, but we're constantly adding more and more salt into the system. That is spring runoff, but you'll also see acute spikes in water levels in the summertime during drought, because water will become, you'll get less water and it will start drawing off the groundwater aquifers from beside the river, and salinity levels can increase during the summertime when you wouldn't think it would, because we're not applying salt to our roadways. So it's really something that gets into the water systems, the groundwaters, the surface waters, and they interact together and really cause a long-standing problem.
All right, so whose data is this?
This would be,
On, and
this is Matt Vaughn's, who's,
yeah, but I'm curious, Middlebury River's not on here. Were all of the tributaries tested, or?
I'm not entirely sure. I know he tested a bunch of them. I believe he is coming for your committee Thursday morning, Madam Chair.
Okay,
But I know he's done this in a number of other studies about salinity levels in the waters of Lake Champlain and its tributaries. So I'm not sure whether or not those rivers have been tested or not, or just aren't included in this case.
And this is the most recent information you have.
Representative Pritchard.
Sorry. Yeah,
Yeah, my understanding, this is actually from a 2019, so he probably has more recent numbers than this, but I mean, the trend is.
Everything seems,
The trend, no, I couldn't explain to you why the Winooski, which is up top, did a sudden dip and then did another spike, but you know, the meadowy below it is a pretty steady climb. And I have to imagine with the increased use of salt and just the steady use that it has been is, you know, these increased rates are being seen.
but in 23 and 22, there was very little use.
Well, I think you will see that, and we've had discussions of, you know, just in general on salt use. It's like every year. So part of the bill is trying to figure out exactly a baseline of how much salt is being used in the state, so you have a sense of how much is being imported. Not the 40-pound bags you get at Home Depot, but sort of a bulk salt. And you're right, every year when you talk to the commercial applicators, it's some years they use a lot and some years they use a little. So it's, I mean,
But Meadowy would be state, and that's monitored and measured already.
Yes.
That's Route 30. That's a state road. Has nothing.
it is, that is separate from this. Now, there's that in the bill. The state has, V-Trans has a very specific program that they use with their trucks about measured amounts of salt in brine during certain conditions and what temperature and how much to use and how fast the truck is going. That actually is something that would be used to help model for municipal applicators. The state has a very good system on, you know, computerized trucks and everything and how much salt that they apply. Where you find the problem more so is the commercial applicators who don't have that technology. And because of the conditions and because of the contracts that they have, they tend to just put down a lot of salt, just to be on the safe side. Quite
That was the point
literally.
I was trying to make, Jared.
Yes,
Meadowy, it's Route 30. It's all state. It's all measured. It has been measured.
and it's all going up.
But what I think the proposal is to cut it down through the same process. So the state is process right now is as good as it gets.
Yep.
It's measured, it's calibrated.
Yep.
There's no commercial trucks
I don't-
salting the Meadowy.
I don't have an explanation for that one.
Well,
That's a good point.
It is a good point.
But it is like, you know, it's based on this, so I'll get to it a little bit more, but the program is based on not only the state, but also best management practices for commercial applicators in a program that's currently being used in New Hampshire.
Fair enough.
But it is the same sort of principles of when to use brine, when to use salt, and what's the temperatures and how much do you put down and the rates of application and things of that nature. And there's also a liability program that helps out if you're following these process and you get certified, you get some liability protection from slip and fall. Now, why the Meadowy is spiking like that, and if it's just all state application, that's a good question for the state folks, I suppose. Well, that agency.
Yeah.
So I think generally you're seeing increased trends in salinity due to salt application statewide. So H86 and S29, act relating to establishing the chloride contamination reduction program at the Agency of Natural Resources. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the point of the bill is to create a program that reduces the amount of salt that's being used on roads and on sidewalks while still keeping the public safe from slipping and falling and accidents and things of that nature. It's how do you use best management practices to create a program that walks that line and finds that balance. As I mentioned, this is New Hampshire has a program that addresses both commercial, and now is just starting to address municipal applicators, but they've been had the program for commercial applicators for about 10 years. New York and the Adirondacks has a program that's really more modeled for municipal applicators, not commercial applicators. And I think Maine has a program that's similar. There's also programs out in Minnesota. Basically, any snowy state is trying to figure this out because they're seeing salinity increases, you know, across the Midwest in a lot of waters. So how do we approach this from using best management practices and programs to keep the public safe but use less salt? And that's what these bills seek to do.
And maybe this is another question for Pete Laflamme, but do we know how much salt is in sand?
There is
Another way of asking that, does sand significantly reduce the amount of salt going into our waterway?
I don't think so. So there's my understanding is there is salt. There is sand mixed with salt, or maybe it's the other way around. Sand mixed with salt, and then there's sand. And most applicators just use pure salt. And some use salt and sand, but they found from my hearing other folks' testimony, and my understanding is that using pure sand, it's great if you're one of the few first cars behind the truck. But once you're car number 20, the sand starts to dissipate and it doesn't have nearly the effects on the ice that pure quote unquote salt does, or some brine or some mixture of that nature.
That's not what I'm asking.
Okay,
I'm asking, is there salt in sand?
there can be.
And if we just went to sand, which there may be other reasons not to, would we have a reduction in salt? Because sand seems like it's likely.
I
Salt,
think if you did less, yes, if you did just go to sand, you would have less use of salt, but I'd also think you would have an argument that it is not as good as keeping the public safe on roads because it spreads itself out more quickly.
I'm gonna find out how much salt is in sand. That's what I want to know.
I think that would be a good question for the Agency of Transportation.
Yeah. Representative Barthol.
That would depend on whether they mixed it intentionally and how much and from where they got the sand.
Yes,
The sand
Good.
in
I know, I'm just,
the coast
Curious.
can have a lot of salt.
yeah, I'm just curious, because we got a lot of sand in this state too.
I think that, to John's point, the salt that's mixed in with sand is used to keep the sand from freezing solid, so it can still be used. And that's gonna probably vary by who's storing it and where they're storing it.
There's also a whole provision about whether the salt sheds are covered. There's some are and some aren't, and obviously if you get precipitation on salt, and you have A can wash away into the groundwater, but B can turn into one big lump of salt and sort of fused together. So, so the bill, these the State House steps? No, I don't think so. So the bill achieves this through a couple of different manners. It's development of best management practices for municipal and commercial salt applicators. It creates a certification program for liability protection. There's requirements for salt storage facilities to avoid water contamination. The as introduced bills had expanded monitoring of water salinity levels, which is still in the bill up here, but no longer in the Senate bill. And then there's a level of tracking the import of salt into the state to try to get a sense of how much salt we are using as a baseline. I think that's still in the bill. The certification program is really key. It's I think one thing that you have to stress upon with the commercial applicator program is it's a voluntary program. We got that question a lot in the Senate. Well, what if we're making somebody who just on the side spread salt on 5 properties, 5 driveways as part of a plow business? Well, you don't have to participate in this. It's a voluntary program. But the point is that we're trying to get as many people involved in this program as possible to make it effective. To do this, you have to have a few carrots. One of them is the liability protection, which I'll talk about in a moment. Another one is saving through the purchase of less salt. I think, that's just basic numbers. Salt's expensive. If you use less of it because you're in a certification program and you have and are utilizing the practices, you don't have to go out and buy as much salt. And then for municipalities, there's also, compliance with water quality standards could mean, less future costs for cleanup of specific waters or having to implement best management practices around specific waters. So I think that there are some ways for applicators to save money and to be protected in terms of liability. As we were talking about a minute ago, Vermont Agency of Transportation has best management practices plan called I can't see the whole thing. It's called the Snow and Ice Control Plan, which they go through and update every couple of years. And you can see I've clicked out a little, the potential percentage of chloride reduction over on the sidebar there, where if they're pre-wetting application of liquids or being applied to a roadway, you can see salt reduction of 20-30%. Et cetera, all the way down. But there are techniques and there are technology out there that allows them to very specifically calibrate how much salt that they're going to apply in specific circumstances to keep the roadway safe, but use as little as possible. The goal of this program is to translate this over through the state program, the VTrans program, over to municipalities through their local roads program, but through commercial applicators through best management practices in a program created at the Agency of Natural Resources. So the initial bill had both of those in the Agency of Natural Resources, but in the development of the conversation about how this would proceed, it seems natural that AOT would take over municipalities because they already have their local roads program and it could just include BMPs for municipal applicators as part of that, where commercial applicator program would be over at the Agency of Natural Resources. One area that I don't think we really nailed down was municipal application on salt and parking lots, schools, things of that nature. But I think that could sort of settle itself out as the program is developed over at AOT and at ANR. New Hampshire is sort of the model. It's called the Green Snow Certification Program. It's, like I said, it started about 10 years ago as a certification program for commercial applicators. You go through, they have the best management practices, you go through the program, you get the certification. You have to keep very meticulous records of your application and times and how much salt you've used and things of that nature. But when you go through this certification program, you come into compliance under the program and under the safety umbrella, and you're given the liability protection that is seen, in this bill. This is the language in this bill, highlighting is mine, of course, but it is modeled off of verbatim off the New Hampshire program. It is very narrow and specific that will not be liable for damages arising from hazards on real property when, the hazards are caused solely by ice or snow. So if you forget to check the brake line on the trucks and the brakes fail on you and you crash into somebody else's car, well, that's not a hazard caused solely by snow or ice. Snow or ice it's basically a slip and fall. And then failure or delay in moving and mitigating the hazard is a result of the implementation of best management practices. So basically, you have to follow the program and you have to keep accurate records of the program. And if you do so, you are offered this liability unless you have reckless disregard of the hazard, i.e. if you're grossly negligent and way outside the duties of what you're trying to do. But this is sort of the carrot of that program in New York that's become very popular and has seen a rapid expanse of folks who have been involved. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but can get them to the committee about how many people they started in their first year and year 10, how many folks they have involved. And they have since moved expanded would be a better way of expanding the program into municipal application in New York. We would have a slightly different program here in that the program would be split between commercial and muni between the two separate agencies. But one thought was, if we model the program after New York, if we basically lift their program up here and apply it in Vermont, then you could have an applicator that is certified on both sides of the border. So if somebody was based in Norwich but also plowed in Hanover or wherever up and down, they could be potentially under the same certification program and get the same protections and also the same, environmental benefits and infrastructure benefits on both sides of the border. So there has been some talk about, how you would work closely with New Hampshire to basically mimic their program in this state to a best of the degree and have this be applicable in both states.
So my understanding is this is the section of the bill that kind of gummed it up on the Senate side. Can you speak?
A liability provision.
Yeah, can you know how New Hampshire's dealt with it and why it's a concern on our side?
Figure out how I can phrase this delicately. So as not to, so the bill was moved out of Senate Natural Resources, and that afternoon it was brought into Senate Judiciary because of concerns about the gross negligence standard. In the bill, there are some parties that are concerned that is too much of a standard and that there would be certain circumstances where the liability protection shouldn't be warranted under certain negligence standards. So at some point, I think next week or week after, we will all go into Senate Judiciary and argue with the various parties about why it needs to be a gross negligence standard and how important it is. With a voluntary program, you need the liability protection, or otherwise there's really not the carrot. If it was a mandatory program, all commercial, I don't know how you would do that, but all commercial applicators have to be, certified in order to apply salt and have a license or however you would say to do it. Then you don't really necessarily need the liability protection. But I think this is a main carrot, but there are concerns of whether or not this is narrowly drawn enough just to be on slip and falls on snow and ice in application, or is this going to somehow apply to somebody's truck getting away from them and running somebody over? So it's an attorney thing, I guess you could say.
Representative Pritchard.
So who would be responsible for paying the bill for a liability if it came up? Is that the state of Vermont? Taxpayers?
No, it would, So somebody who is suing would hire their own attorney and pay for it that way, and either the commercial applicator would hire their attorney or more likely their boss. Those have been the cases in New Hampshire. There's been one or two that have gone through, but they have been somebody who has not an individual applicator, but somebody who has several trucks in a business, and they would go and hire an attorney and defend themselves. It's not a state. It's not New Hampshire. It's not a state expense.
Okay, so why would it be any different than normal, I guess?
Well, you have an extra level of protection. The attorneys for the plaintiff would have to go into court and prove that the applicator was being grossly negligent, in their responsibilities and wasn't following the program and wasn't following the best management practices. So it create a higher bar to be found civilly liable and potentially protect that applicator of several million dollars in civil penalties.
So the standard right now is just negligence.
Yes,
Okay,
that's my understanding.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, are there other countries or states that don't use salt? Like Russia or?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think it's always sort of some variation of chloride, whether it's sodium chloride or potassium chloride. And I know there have been some variations of using beet solutions and other substances, but I think salt is pretty much the norm. I don't know if there's a practice in other states. Or other countries rather.
I'm just wondering, is it just like so people can drive faster? I mean, I just wonder if you could just slow down a bit, if
There could be that argument. I mean, I don't know when we started applying
I'm
salt to roads. Do you guys have an idea of when we started applying it, that the practice really became at some point in the age of the automobile? I have to imagine that
Data started in 75.
Yeah, so at some point people did just slow down or didn't drive or exactly.
I just wonder if some places just use sand or use something else.
I think used to just use sand. Representative Labor.
Thank you. Has DEC measured the salinity or changes in salinity of our northernmost lakes like Averill or Norton, Seymour, Echo?
I would assume so, but I'm going to defer to the department on that question.
Have you tested the salinity of the northern lakes?
Thank you, Chair Sheldon. For the record, Pete LaFlamme, I'm Director of the Watershed Management Division at DEC. Typically, we see the impacts mostly in the areas that drain large areas of impervious surface. So dense areas with a lot of roads, a lot of parking lots, sidewalks, that sort of a situation. That's where we're seeing the most acute impact. So typically the Northeast Kingdom lakes would not have that. They don't have the areas that need that amount of salt, especially it's the amount of salt applied sort of divided through by the watershed. Matt Bond, who you'll hear from on Thursday morning from the Basin Program, and you've seen some of his data here today, Lake Champlain. When you think about the total volume of Lake Champlain, the amount of water in that lake, and the amount of salt you need to mix with that water to actually see a change in concentration, we are seeing it in Champlain. So, I mean, that gives an indication, but that drains the whole western side of the state. So in the Northeast Kingdom, those watersheds don't drain a lot of impervious surface. So I'm not aware of any data we can check, but I'm not aware of any data we have on the lakes that you mentioned.
Well, the reason I asked the question is most of the lakes, the boundaries surrounding the lake is state roads. The camps and secondaries
Right.
are dirt roads.
Right.
But they do see chloride spread in the summertime to avoid dust.
Yes.
That's the other use of chloride. You're exactly right. The wetting solution of chlorides to hold dust down.
That is acknowledged in the bill as well. Yeah.
Are the states who've passed these voluntary programs seeing improvements in the amount of salt concentration?
I think they're seeing improvements in New Hampshire, in the Adirondacks. I'm not sure about New Hampshire if they're seeing market improvement yet.
You probably mentioned it, but when did theirs go into effect?
New York went into effect, New Hampshire went into effect 10 years ago. New York went into effect in the Adirondacks, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago.
Representative
When you
Pritchard.
say the Adirondacks, what part is that, Jerry? Is that like Lake George, like
Park.
I think it's all the way through. It's all the way down to Lake
so
George.
from Champlain all the way? to
Lake
Montreal?
George down to Peru, down that area and all the way up. I know that actually the programs on Lake George are one of the first pilot programs in New York, is my understanding. The municipal programs down there have been, I think they've been very popular and very successful down on Lake George. But they have been seeing the increase in salinity levels sort of all the way through the Adirondacks with when the water body's there. So it's a lot of the road spreading up throughout the park. I think they have programs up in Plattsburgh as well.
Yeah, I mean, New York puts it down. Where I live, you can tell when you leave Vermont, go to New York.
Yeah,
Because the roads are bare.
I was about to say it's the bare roads theory.
And they've always been that way. I mean, I don't see any change in
Okay,
well, I'm in the road condition.
in the road conditions.
I mean, they're literally bare.
Yeah. Well, this video clip, I'll have to send it around, notes that, the salinity levels of the reservoirs into, that are used as drinking water in New York City. And those are pretty big reservoirs as well. And it's a call, he makes a call to action for the towns that, are up there to start using less and less salt, or otherwise, they're going to have real problems with drinking water in New York City. So I was hoping to lead with that, but I don't trust YouTube very well. So
The soundbite I heard on that was they were actually cautioning people with high blood pressure already
yeah.
about drinking the water.
Another provision of the bill is, bill requires best management practices for salt storage sheds, including being undercover by 2035. There are various points, in the bill about, various deadlines if a salt shed is within 100 yards of, I'm doing this off the top of my head, 100 yards of the water source. It has to be covered by 2030. Other ones have to be covered by 2035, but it is noted that Senator Westman had a proposal that was added, a study asking the agency to go look and get a sense of exactly how many uncovered salt sheds are out there, how many of them are close to water supplies, how many of them are not, and to get a sense of how much it's going to cost to start covering these salt storage sheds. That report would be due, I think it's January of 2026, and that would help sort of inform the discussion on exactly how much it's going to cost to start covering salt storage sheds, which can be expensive. In some cases, it might be less expensive for a town to move the salt away from the river and someplace that is not close to a water body. But that's going to be sort of a town by town basis. My understanding from Senator Westman is in Lamoille County, a few towns have had this conversation for quite a while, and they want to cover the asset too. You don't want it to sort of wash away. But there are best management practices other than covering that can be used to prevent runoff into groundwater and into surface waters. And that is part of this as well. Some of it needs to be a little bit more studying to understand the breadth of the issue. And it would apply to state and municipal storage areas. I think the thought is that it would be really difficult to figure out every small little private storage down to the barrel in the little pile, so to speak, would be really sort of difficult to track. I mean, what you're aiming for is the larger storage facilities. And I think down to the bigger salt storage areas. But that is something that will also be sort of hammered out in this study that Senator Westman has proposed.
Did the study include the cost of a TMDL?
It did not include the study of the cost. We have had, is it still only one? Sunnyside Brook in Colchester is the current chloride TMDL, but my understanding is the department is looking at others. And so this would allow, if you're going to put in best management practices around the state, it would prevent the department from having to, every time that there is a smaller brook or tributary that hits an acute or chronic level, would have to do a TMDL and best management practices for that little specific stream, brook, or river, which could get involved, and they can talk about that more than I can, certainly. And that's it. That's the end of the program. Thank you. This is another pet peeve of mine that doesn't have a lot to do with salt, but
Good.
But just sort of pushing the snow into the river. I get it. It's hard to sometimes to find other places to put it, but At any rate, any further questions?
Thank you for your presentation, Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thought the state stopped that.
Oh, this was, I took this, that's a couple of weeks ago. The same bridge. So this is, I'm standing on School Street Bridge, and that's Langdon Street right there, and
They're all driveways.
State Street is further down, and these are all little private parking areas that are next to businesses.
All right, thanks for, all right. What I want to make sure is that, how much time do you think you'll need, Pete? If you go today?
At least 20 minutes.
Yeah,
It'll
okay.
be somewhat of an ad hoc presentation today.
I can wait then.
But I'm happy to speak about it, answer any questions that you
Okay.
may have, and then show back up on Thursday morning if you're willing.
Okay, sure. Yeah, great. Okay, great. Well, Representative Austin, do you have a quick
Just a
question?
quick question. Do you know what the cost is? I know it depends on the storm or the winter, but is there some estimate of how much this costs
You know, how like per storm, how much it costs to
roughly?
put salt down? No, that's part of this in the bill is trying to get a handle on how much salt is being used, you know, not only as a baseline. You know, so we can get a sense of how much is being used, knowing that you're not gonna be able to capture.
Yeah.
40-pound bags that are sold at Home Depot. It's really more of the bulk applicators, and that it really varies from winter to winter and how much you're gonna use based on what the weather conditions are. I mean, so I think a fair amount was used this past winter, but it was maybe 2 or 3 winters ago where a lot less was used. So I think it's just generally trying to get the trend down all across the board, knowing that you're gonna have variables that you can't track, you know, won't be able to track all of it, preventatively.
We're gonna switch to Pete Laflamme here. And thanks, Jared.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee. Appreciate the time.
You want us to pull your testimony up, or do you want to just give us an overview of your?
I'm happy to give just an overview if that's acceptable, Chair.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. And I'm here today with Bethany Sargent, the Deputy Director of the division, that can certainly chime in as well. But for the record, again, I'm Pete Laflamme. I'm Director of the Watershed Management Division at Vermont DEC. And following up on Jared's excellent presentation, I can fill in talk a little bit about it. We, as you all know, the companion bill that started out in the exact same form as your bill was S-29 on the Senate side, and we did provide several iterations of testimony there on this, and S-29 has moved in terms of the language. We're on version 4 point something, and some of the information that Jared testified about today in your bill, we did not necessarily agree with, and so it has evolved some, but the core of the bill remains the same. And the purpose of the bill really, as Jared stated, is to optimize the amount of salt that's used. We recognize obviously the importance of safe surfaces, roads, safe parking lots, safe sidewalks. And we've worked well over the years with the Agency of Transportation in terms of their optimization of the use of salt from their big orange trucks. They've employed a lot of technology. They measure road surface temperature. They've used brine. They've used different staging techniques in terms of applying salt during the course of a storm. Pre-wetting, they have a number of techniques. And I know that you're going to get testimony on Thursday morning from the Agency of Transportation, and certainly they can talk more about the techniques they've used. We've had a good partnership with them in terms of managing and optimizing the amount of salt they used, enough to maintain those safe surfaces, but not to an excess amount where it's adversely affecting our water resources. And as Jared testified to, and we have some information about as well, we are seeing increasing salt concentrations, as I spoke about a moment ago, especially in those watersheds where there's a large amount of impervious surface relative to the size of the receiving water. So you think these small streams that drain urban areas, the TMDL or the cleanup plan that Jared spoke of at Sunnyside Brook. So exit 16 in Colchester, if you get off and go to the right at the bottom of that exit, you go past the area where Costco is located. There's a supermarket up on the hill. There's a lot of office buildings. It's a busy area. You've got the municipality of Colchester maintaining roads in that area. You have AOT with I-89 and routes 2 and 7 going through there. But then you also have a lot of privately owned properties. And those commercial applicators, as some of Jared's pictures showed, will put down excess amounts of salt to avoid liability, either at the behest of the property owner who wants to avoid that liability, or the applicator, the commercial applicator themselves. And this same problem is seen across the country. In the northern tier areas that have snow and ice tend to have these same problems. So we work well with our agency of transportation on the state road networks. Some municipalities we're working well with, some municipalities we just haven't reached yet, and then the commercial applicators. So the spirit of this bill is aimed primarily at the commercial applicators, but also the municipalities, and providing training and a certification program to these applicators so that the amount of salt applied is optimized. Because as Jared mentioned in his presentation, we see waters increasing in salinity, and there really are two criteria that we look at. We look at chronic, which is the long-term, the aquatic organisms, the invertebrates, the fish that feed upon those invertebrates that live in those waters, and other animals that intersect with those waters. Exposure to a lower level of chloride over time leads to chronic health concerns with them, and also then has a deleterious effect on those biota. And then you get acute concentrations that have a more immediate effect on the organism. Interestingly, what we found in doing the research to develop the TMDL on Sunnyside Brook is that a lot of the salt that's delivered comes during the summer, comes during late August. The most severe effects are when the streams are at their low flow. You get a rainfall event, and the salt that's stored in the soil of the watershed leaches into the stream as a result of that. And then you don't have a lot of stream flow to dilute that salt that's running off. Salt is what's called a conservative substance. It doesn't go away. Once you get it into the environment, you can't get it back out of the environment. It doesn't attenuate something like phosphorus or nitrogen even. Salt stays. And so it resides in the roadsides, it resides in the riverbanks. And then when you get those events in the summer, that's when we see a lot of the adverse effect. That same thing can happen in the winter. So there's the most significant next best step we can take with chloride and to try to manage chloride. And it's not a panacea. It's not the ultimate solution. Moving away from a chloride-based de-icing basis in the winter is important to do. But right now, this is a problem again across the northern tier. And right now there's not a viable alternative to use other than chloride application. So stuck with that paradigm, optimizing the amount of salt. And this program is based on a carrot, not a stick. This is based upon, as Jared's slide showed, providing the certification program, and then in exchange, having that limited liability protection with a gross negligence standard provides that carrot to the applicator to apply a lesser amount of chloride and apply it in best management practice ways that allows safe de-icing of the surface. It provides for the commercial applicator to receive that limited liability protection. And it also has the applicator putting down less salt, and salt is expensive. And so the applicator gets that benefit as well. It's a program that I think 4 or 5 states maybe now have adopted. Some of the upper Midwestern states, New Hampshire, New York has a program similar to that. So it's an approach to reduce the amount of salt that's going into the environment and to slow the increase we're seeing in our waters, and particularly in those small urban drainages where there's a lot of it's the big box store parking lot, it's the sidewalks in those sorts of developments, and it's just that that excess salt. And when you see it, when you go in the side door of the State House here and you crunch your way across, it's not ice crystals, it's salt. And then you see the drop inlet right there, the grate that's going to go down when it rains. That salt's going to get washed into the drop inlet and go out to a water body somewhere, and then eventually accumulate in the lake. And so we're concerned about the near field concentrations in the receiving water that those surfaces flow to in the first place, and then the ultimate receiving water, the lake at the base of the watershed. In this case, coming from here, it's going to Lake Champlain. And it's conservative, so it's going to stay in the system and it's going to move. And so we support the bill. We disagree with some of and happy to go through and provide that exact testimony on Thursday, but we disagree with some of the enhanced monitoring requirements that are proposed in the bill, and then also some of the record keeping for the state, keeping records of the amount of salt shipped into the state on an annual basis is an inexact figure, and I don't think tracking those numbers will provide us the success story that we might seek in tracking those numbers. But again, we'd be happy to come back and provide more specific line by line testimony of the proposed bill if you would like, Chair Sheldon. But for now, that's what I can say about this bill, our support overall for the bill, the importance of tying that limited liability protection to the certification program. It is a voluntary program, so we want to incentivize applicators, getting the certification and optimizing their application of salt. And that's the single best way of doing it. As Jared mentioned, there's also a companion piece that has AOT through their local roads program, providing enhanced application training to municipalities. And so we would be able to reach municipalities through the AOT training program, and ANR would contract out with an entity to do that training for commercial applicators, that voluntary certification training for commercial applicators. It's a problem. It's a problem nationwide across the northern tier. It's a problem here in Vermont, where we see that steady trend line of increase. There's fluctuations depending on the winter. This winter that we just had, certainly a lot of municipalities used a lot of their salt and salted sand piles during this winter, and then we'll have winters like the preceding winter where it really wasn't much of a winter, and less salt was used. So you do see that fluctuation year to year, and then you see sort of the time release, if you will, of that chloride that's stored in the watershed, in the soils, eventually leaching into the receiving water. So there's a lot of variability in the system, and it's hard to have a true one-to-one, we put less salt on this winter as a result of optimization, so all is well. It's going to be a long-term effort, and it's going to be slow progress, but this bill and this program is a really important first step.
Representative North.
Yeah, a couple of questions. One is, what's like, other ways to call it, other than like a memory effect, given that the salt doesn't go away, you spread it and it may stick around in the dirt or, nearby areas for a while, and it doesn't show up in the waters until later. So how long would it take if you just stopped applying salt period altogether? How long would it take before you actually start to see it?
It's a great question, and I don't have the answer for it. Years.
It must have, as long as 10 years or just like.
It depends a lot on the watershed, on the distance from where the salt's applied on the road, how much of a buffer you have to the river. There are areas like leaving Montpelier eastbound where river road, anyways, 302 and 2 going eastbound is pinned right up against the Winooski. And so that's going to get delivered fairly quick, and it will, depending on how much salt is stored in the water in that bank, it's going to leach out as opposed to being further away. And then also the practices. I mean, AOT found that when they're applying from the big orange trucks, using a lot of pure rock salt, there was the bounce effect where they would put it on the road and, those pellets would bounce, just like when you catch a rock in the windshield, those pellets would bounce and go off the edge of the road. So, using different techniques for applying that salt. But so it's highly variable. I hesitate to guess, but I know it would be at least years. So there's going to be a delayed effect that when we turn the salt down, still, it's not an immediate solution.
So that might affect the answer to my next question, which is, do we know of any or have any long-term data from states that have done this or areas that have done the application of best practices to see any reduced salinity in the associated groundwaters?
I can respond to that. Again, Bethany Sargent, I'm the Deputy Director for the Watershed Management Division. So I've spoken with the New Hampshire coordinator about their program. They have the long-standing program. It's been around for about a decade, at least for commercial applicators. And what they've expressed is that there's a lot of variability in the data that makes it very challenging to draw conclusions about the overall effectiveness of the program. And obviously you can look at the BMP level and say that based on implementation of these best management practices, we're optimizing the amount of salt that we apply. But knowing that you're reaching a portion of those individuals who are applying salt, knowing the variability from winter to winter in terms of the amount of salt that's actually used, and then just nuances of the watershed itself and the soil type and the size and the impervious surface cover, it's really hard to tease that out. And so it really is a program that relies on the design of the best management practices with the objective of optimizing salt use, to not over apply, to not under apply, knowing that we also have the dual goal of maintaining safe surfaces. And so again, you know, a lot of the pieces of the bill as it was originally introduced attempt to try to draw those numbers out by estimating the amount of salt that's imported, doing a lot of monitoring. But because of that variability, because we're only getting a portion of the population that's applying salt, and really, I mean, it is a critical piece. It's too hard to tease out those numbers. We're also, you know, in terms of the monitoring efforts, we can predict really well where we're going to see high chloride levels in our surface waters based on the watershed size to impervious surface ratio, based on the distance of the impervious surface to the surface water. A lot of our lakes do have roads right along the perimeter, and where we see, you know, like where we have I-91 and municipal roads running right alongside some lakes, we see higher chloride concentrations as a result of that. So we don't necessarily need the water quality monitoring effort to predict where we're going to find higher concentrations. We do need water quality monitoring when we are assessing a surface water relative to our water quality standards for chloride to determine whether it meets or exceeds the acute or chronic criteria. And then we do, you know, much more sort of in the stream, real-time monitoring of conductivity that we're able to look at it and see how it is impacted relative to those standards.
So the natural follow-on question then would be, do we have enough data to know that it is the salt being applied to roadways that is actually the driver of salinity, or could it just be the dirt or some other source that we're
based on where we're seeing the highest concentrations? It is in those small watersheds that have a high percentage of impervious surfaces. For the Sunnyside chloride TMDL that we developed last year, we looked at the amount of salt. We were able to work with the municipality of Colchester to estimate the salt that they've been applying with VTrans, to estimate the amount that they have been applying. We didn't know what to estimate for the commercial applicators. There's no way to get at that group of salt applicators to estimate either how much salt they've been applying, and then in turn, in terms of, you know, a target that the TMDL identifies, how to get them incentivized to meet that target. But it is going to be variable across winters. So yeah, it is a challenge, but it is certainly, you know, the smaller watersheds and really those commercial applicators and the areas where we have really significant parking lot coverage, where we have the most unknowns in terms of the salt supply.
Your last question, Representative Bartholomew.
Does the salt accumulate or does it stay in solution? Like phosphorus, it gets down into the mud and stuff, but the salt just stay in solution?
Not really in solution, but it doesn't bind, like phosphorus will adsorb to especially clay particles. It's sort of an electrostatic attraction. So you will get some attenuation. The problem then is it also can break loose. So phosphorus is hard to track. It's taken up by biota, by plants and other things as well. So the chloride though is more of a free agent. It resides in the soil and it will wash out. It will rinse out.
Gets in the water, then it just becomes saltier water. and it
That's
stays in
exactly
solution.
right. That's
So if
exactly
the
right.
salt is going into, or like the Connecticut River,
Yes,
it's gonna end up in the ocean.
right.
Is that a problem?
Not in the ocean, no,
And then-
because these concentrations are less than the salinity of
And
the
then what
ocean.
about something like Champlain? It flows. Is it accumulating there? Or does it flush out? I mean, obviously a lake that's contained and the water flows into it and there's no outflow, it's gonna accumulate. But what about Champlain?
It will, if we were able to magically turn off that knob and turn off the salt going into the watershed, Champlain would eventually, over a long period of time, flush out. But it's the continuous and in fact increasing input of chlorides into it that's continuing to feed that system and continuing to make it
It's
saltier
got a
over
very
time.
slow flush.
Very
Mhm.
slow flush.
Yes.
It's when you think about the volume of a 120-mile long lake and the width of it, I mean, it's an incredible amount of water in there, which again is sort of awe-inspiring when you think about the amount of salt that you need to mix, the tens, hundreds of thousands, I don't know, we could do the math in terms of the amount of salt that's necessary to make that lake more saline.
All right, well, thanks for joining us and we'll have you back on Thursday.
Great, thank you so much, Chair Sheldon.
Members, we're going to take a brief break, 5 minutes.